I'm Jarod Johnson, and this is my partner Rachel Wales. For this experiment, the Demography project, we're comparing the mortality rates from England during the 1800s and the 1900s. And our purpose was essentially that we're recording the births and deaths of people in England during the 19th century and the 20th century in order to see if the mortality rates during those time periods in England are influenced by things like general societal advancement or the advancement of the medical industry. Because during the 19th century, we saw a lot of things like penicillin and organ transplants being developed, along with the germ theory during the late 1800s. The hypothesis was that if we compared those mortality rates from the 1800s to the 1900s, then that mortality rate would be significantly higher during the 19th century than it would in the 20th. And our assumptions were that, we assumed that the data we got from the grave records were all correct, and that the death rates were directly resulted from things like medical advancement and whatnot, not immigrations or general just disasters that couldn't be accounted for. Our rationale was that those social standings and governance would be subject to change over time, as stated earlier with the medical advancements, and the progression of medical care in general would generally lower the mortality rates. All right, you want to take it?
Okay, so we did this experiment by looking at this online cemetery records. So we used method 1 to compare the mortality rates of the people from the 1800s and the people from the 1900s. So basically, method 1 is used to compare the ages at death, and here's the procedure that we followed to do so. So after finishing the experiment, we realized that the hypothesis was somewhat correct. So if we compare mortality rates in England from the 1800s to the 1900s, then the mortality rate will be higher for England, a little bit higher for England during the 19th century compared to the 20th century. After conducting the experiment, we can conclude that overall the mortality rate seems to be around the same for both the 1800s and the 1900s. According to the data, both groups seem to have the most deaths around the ages 61 to 80, and we can see that here by looking at the life table and the survivorship curve. But yet again, there's a lot of people dying at a younger age for both, and the reason for this similarity could be due to illnesses brought about by the onset of industry. It seems to affect both people of the 1800s and the 1900s. And the 1800s have a slightly larger death rate for the younger ages. And when we look here, for ages 1 to 10, the number dying for 1800s is 20, and for ages 1 to 10, the number dying for the 1900s is only 9. And both survivorships curves look similar. They're both type 2. Type 2 means that there is a constant mortality survivorship rate throughout their life expectancies. Usually humans have type 3 curve, which represents a low mortality rate for the younger ages and a high mortality rate for the older ages, and these two groups have a different survivorship curve compared to what a normal human population will have now. And here are some future project ideas. And since the time periods were quite close together and there's only a 100-year difference, next experiment we should make the time period gap between the two groups greater by at least a century, so that there could be more significant changes in mortality rates over time. And also we can take a sample population larger than 200 to get a more accurate representation. And lastly, we could take into account other contributing factors to changes in mortality rate across age groups, such as natural disasters and also nations that are similarly developed in medical industry in our test populations. And that's like US nations that didn't advance to a significant degree. Your citation.